Hi, welcome back to Elite Literary Book Group. I'm Rachel Beck, and I'm going to finish Melchester. Today it's part 3. So I can tell you, if you've made it this far, reading it's going to be so much easier for the rest of the way. It only takes about 100 to 200 pages to get into Thomas Hardy. So if you've done that, now the rest of it's going to be pretty good. But that's just the way it is with Thomas Hardy. It takes a while, but it's so worth it in the end. Okay, so the chapter 7 in part 3, it starts out with a letter to Jude from Sue, and it has a very different tone than her other letters. In fact, she signs her full name, which she's never done before. So it says, "I have something to tell you, which perhaps you will not be surprised to hear, though certainly it might strike you as being accelerated, as the railroad companies say of their trains. Mr. Phillotson and I are to be married quite soon, in 3 or 4 weeks. We have intended, as you know, to wait till I had gone to my course training and obtained my certificate, so to assist him, if necessary, in the teaching. But he generously says he does not see any object in waiting, now that I'm not in training school. It is so good of him, because the awkwardness of my situation has really come about my fault in getting expelled. Wish me joy. Remember, I say, you are too. And you mustn't refuse your affectionate cousin, Susanna Florence Mary Brighthead." And as I've said before, if you've watched any of the other videos, that Florence is the name of was the name of Hardy's mistress when he was married. So it would have been very probably awkward for Emma, his wife, to see this, since she knew Florence and she knew something was going on, even though Hardy would probably say that the relationship was completely platonic. After Emma died, he did marry Florence. So here she is, and I think she was a lot like Sue. She probably frustrated Hardy like Sue does with men, would be my guess. And so Jude reads this, and I love this verb choice here. Jude staggered under the news, could eat no breakfast, and went on drinking his tea because his mouth was so dry. Then he presently went back to work and laughed a usual bitter laugh of a man so confronted. Everything seemed turning to satire. And yet, what could the poor girl do, he asked himself, and felt worse than shedding tears. "Oh, Susanna Florence Mary," he said as he worked, "you don't know what marriage means." And you get a little bit more about Hardy's tone towards marriage, which was another reason, it was seen as it just improper in Victorian times to be this hard on this sacrament, that's supposed to be amazing. And often it's not. And you see an inscription in the next chapter where Hardy quotes John Stuart Mill, who was taking up for defending the right to divorce. That if you make people stay together when they don't want to, you're going to ruin their individual lives and their individuality and their pursuit of happiness. Though he doesn't use those words, it's very American words coming from me, but something like that, right? Okay, so she writes back a second time, and the next time she does, she asks him to give her away. Since, you're the closest relation I have, I could ask my father if he's willing and friendly over it, but he's not. Dad won't do it. So I need you to do it. And she emphasizes the fact that I need a married relation. You're married. You can be the father who gives me away. Which, doesn't really set well with Jude, but the rest of the letter is kind of interesting, because she says, "I've been looking at the marriage service in the prayer book, and it seemed to me very humiliating that a giver away should be required at all. According to the ceremony, as they're printed, my bridegroom chooses me of his own will and pleasure, but I don't choose him. Somebody gives me to him, like a she-ass or she-goat, or any other domestic animal. Bless your exalted views of woman, O churchman. But I forget, I'm no longer privileged to tease you. Ever, Susanna Florence, Mary, Brighthead. So he finally gets enough strength to write back, and he makes what would be kind of a strange proposal that you should come stay with me, since it would be a lot more convenient for you and Phillotson. And so they make this arrangement, and they're staying not in the same room, of course, but kind of it's different quarters. Phillotson is welcome anytime. So there's not a whole lot of suspicion between the two of them going on. Leading up to the wedding, things are actually kind of tense. One thing I just forgot to mention that's kind of important is the feeling that Jude has in receiving these news is, we're going to get married now. Soon. Jude starts to feel like he might have been the reason to bring it on, because she found out about Arabella and found out that, he's married. And he has a moment where he thinks, maybe this, hasty decision is my fault for what I've done in my part. And it says here, what oppressed Jude was the thought that, having done a wrong thing of this sort himself, he was aiding and abetting the woman he loved into doing a like wrong thing, instead of imploring and warning her against it. It was on his tongue to say, have you quite made up your mind? And so there's it's important because it kind of shows the tragedy of it. Jude introduced Sue to Phillotson. Jude has to tell Sue that he's married. And then it seems like right after that, she decides she's going to get married too. So that's part of what is also eating at Jude. But he also knows that this marriage is going to be miserable. And she's not going to be happy. And here I am, having to play a part in giving her away, which the whole giving away aspect is an interesting point of, kind of showing why we have rules and traditions and so forth, and why there seems to be different expectations of women. It goes back to a patriarchal society. I know people hate to hear that. I preach just as much religion as I do the other stuff, so I try to be fair and balanced. But it is saying someone has to give me away, then what does that imply? But that I don't own myself. That I'm not the mistress of myself. That first I belong to my father, and then I belong to him. And that's what she's really saying. But most importantly, it's what Hardy is saying. Because really what you're trying to do is figure out what Hardy is saying, so that when you get an essay question or something, you have so much information that you can make a real good case, a good argument for something that might not be obvious to other people. And that's always what you're after, is to look at something in a different perspective that other people might miss. And then you analyze it, and you have to know the text to analyze it and back it up. But it's easier if you know something about Thomas Hardy and the way he thinks. Okay, so they see each other. She's been there, and they get to the church, which it's no accident that the church that they're going to be married into is St. Thomas. So St. Thomas is the disciple who doubted that the other one saw, Jesus. If I can't touch him, then it didn't happen, right? And there was this little Sunday verse in school that I remember about, don't be a doubting Thomas, trust fully in his promise. Why worry, 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 worry when you can pray? Anyways, that's the doubting Thomas. So I checked it, and I checked myself. I checked the footnote, and it says it's no coincidence because Hardy knows what he's doing here. He's going to make all these little connections and allusions. But they have an interesting moment when they get to the church, and Sue does something that she doesn't normally do. She becomes affectionate. It says, by the irony of fate and the curious trick in Sue's nature of tempting providence, is a capital P, so God's providence. At critical times, she took his arm as they walked through the muddy street, a thing she had never done before in her life. And on turning the corner, they found themselves close to a gray perpendicular church with a low-pitched roof, the Church of St. Thomas. They go into the church, and it's almost as if they forget that, I'm giving you away. It almost seems like they're getting married. They're in the church together, arm in arm. They're having this kind of experience. No one else is with them. But of course they run into Phillotson on the way out. And Phillotson is quite confused about what's going on here. And Sue says, it's the funniest thing. We decided that we were going to do a rehearsal without you. And isn't that neat? And anyways, Phillotson isn't, he's not quick. He's kind of a slow thinker. And so they change the subject, and Jude says, I was going to buy her a bonnet or a gift. He ends up getting her a veil. And, they jump right into, I guess this is the same day as the wedding. And I like this description of Phillotson. Phillotson's hair was brushed to a painful extent. This is the way Dickens writes about all his characters, all throughout. That's why he's hilarious. And his shirt collar appeared stiffer than it had been for the previous 20 years. Beyond this, he looked dignified and thoughtful, and altogether a man of whom it was not unsafe to predict that he would make a kind and considerate husband. That he adored Sue was obvious, and she could almost be seen to feel that she was undeserving of his adoration. Okay, so they get married, this is an interesting passage because this has got to be really hard for both of them to have Jude give Sue to Phillotson when really both of them want to be together. And so Jude gets through it, and in his mind, Hardy writes, how could Sue have the temerity to ask him to do it? To ask him to be the one to play the dad, really. A cruelty possible to herself as well as to him. Wouldn't this affect her too? And this is where Hardy says something very interesting to me. Women were different from men in such matters. Was it that they were, instead of more sensitive, as reputed, more callous and less romantic? Or were they more heroic? And I really think that kind of sums up Hardy's view of women, which is, I like hearing that. But it's kind of could we question that a man actually in a relationship could be more sensitive, could have more feeling? Maybe he can't get over certain things that she can get over. It's only assumed that women are supposed to be this way and men are supposed to be that way. But, with Hardy's mind, I don't think he thinks that's altogether true. That it's not just that women, but the interesting twist to that is it that they're just more heroic? Are they better at survival? They do live longer. But, it's an interesting point, especially coming from this time, because you don't normally get that from someone of this age. So at the end of the chapter, Sue says she's left her handkerchief somewhere. someone else says, I'll get it. She says, no, 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 I know where I left it. She runs back in with Jude, and she looked into his eyes with her own tearful ones, and her lips suddenly parted as if she was going to avow something. But she went on, and whatever she meant to say remained unspoken. But there was a connection. And Jude, in the next chapter, it's almost as if he's in shock and thinking, she's going to come back. She has to come back. She's not going to just, stay married. And that's not a reasonable thought at all. Most likely she would. But in his mind, he could not see her. He even thinks about, what would her children? I would love to see a little Sue. And then the thought is, but it's going to be half Phillotson too. Can't just be the mother. So you're going to have, this life that she's going to have is not going to have anything in common anymore with you. And that's really distressing to him. But as fate would have it, then he receives a note that his old aunt, the one he always refers to as his crusty aunt, was dangerously ill at Mary Green, which intelligence coincide with a letter with also an employer from Christminster who says you can come back and I'll give you some permanent work. I'm not sure why he has a change of heart, but he does. And Jude's thought is, well, it's Sue's aunt too. Maybe you would like to see this relation before she dies, because she's going to die soon. So it's another reason, as callous as that sounds, it's another reason to help them get back together. And lovers will use whatever they can. Whatever circumstance, does not matter. But he does something wrong. I mean, he asks Sue to meet him. Of course, they're corresponding by letter, so that's always a tricky thing to do. He doesn't know if Sue's going to come or not. But he says that I will be at this place in Alfredson, and I'll meet you from the train. And it's going to be kind of late, So you would think that Jude would do everything possible not to mess this up, to be there for her. But he ends up finding a friend and going to a bar. And it's the same tavern that he ended up doing the Nicene Creed. I did a video talking about that in detail. And but the place has kind of been renovated in a way. It looks, for their time, I guess, it looks different. And the other guy's like, I don't even like this place anymore. It's almost too modern, to sit and drink a beer in. This isn't the right place. But Jude stays there, and it's blocked with these different compartments is what they call it. And he sees a woman in the glass reflection. He can only see part of her. And she's talking, and she's sort of flirting with this guy. She turns around, and who is it but Arabella? This always happens in Victorian novels. Once you think a character's gone, they're rarely ever gone. They always come back. And it really is a technique that helps thicken the plots. Because obviously we need all the help we can in this book. So Arabella is there, and she's talking to a guy who's asking her about her husband. And she's saying that he's still in Australia, where she is supposed to be. After a little bit of thinking about it, Jude decides to confront her and talk to her because, now they're in the same town. What if people find out about us? I mean, they always have to worry about your reputation. And she sees him and she thinks, oh my God, I thought maybe you were dead by now. Didn't even know you were alive. And he says to her, I wonder why you come to this place. Why Christminster? And well, as I say, I thought you were gone to glory. And being in London, I saw the situation in the advertisement, and she says she decided to get a job. And nobody knows me in Christminster, so I'm safe here. And he says, why did you return from Australia? She says, oh, I have my reasons. And then she asked him, are you done yet? No? a reverend? Anything? Did you become anything? No. I'm exactly what you see as I was. So she decides, like, I got to talk to you about a few things, but we can't talk here. So now she's asking him to meet her after she's done with her shift. This is going to cause a problem because he can't get to Sue now. But the other part that's kind of complicated to understand is why they take a train to go to a different town to talk. I think it's called Aldbrickham, and they stay in a hotel somewhere. It's not clear whether they stay in the same room together. I would assume not, but he only ends it with them having this last supper together. And then in the morning they talk. So it is kind of ambivalent about what exactly happens between those times. And in the meantime, Sue's been stood up by Jude. And of course, you know, he's been drinking. He tries to control himself. But before they leave, Arabella fixes him a really strong drink. And they never even really sort out what they need to talk about. She only tells him that she is in fact married to someone else. And he was like, legally in a church? And she said, yes. You know, I lived with him for a short time. It was stupid, I know, but I did it. There, I've told you. And he says, you know, I have nothing to say about this, you know, crime you've confessed to. It's just crime, poo. They don't think much of that in Australia, which is another response that she's had before about, you don't know what people do in other countries or where I've been around. That sort of thing happens all the time, that you know, married two people at once. Big deal. It happens. So that's Arabella's attitude about everything, especially if you look at her juxtaposition to someone as, you know, anxiety-ridden as Sue. Arabella just doesn't care. And she just kind of lives that way. On his way home, he runs into Sue, who's been out looking for him. Because not only did he stand her up, but he didn't ever come home. She stayed with the aunt and attended to her and thought, you know, at any moment, Jude's going to walk through that door, and he never does. So where was he? And so she finds him, and she says, yeah, I was afraid you would try to drown your sorrow, you know, your gloom in alcohol. And he says, well, you've come to hunt me up and deliver me like a good angel. And of course, what she's really wanting to know is, where were you? Who were you with? She will get to that. It just kind of comes out of almost a jealous, anxious rage of, why didn't you come home last night? And he says he had an appointment at 9 and that he stayed in an inn. And he doesn't tell her that he met Arabella. But, you know, Hardy comments on Jude's feelings after this, and it reminds me sort of like just a bad hangover of, even though he's there with Sue, and Sue's now married, he feels more disgusted with himself about being in the company of Arabella. He almost like when Sue comes, it redeems him. She's the good angel that comes and saves him. Arabella is the devil that tempts him. And so you see the struggle there with the flesh and the spirit. So once they get to talking, he says, you know, Sue, you're married now, you know, like me. And yet we've been in such a hurry, we haven't had, you know, a word to say about it. There's no necessity, she said. She quickly returned. Oh, well, perhaps not, but I wish, Jude, don't talk to me. I wish you wouldn't, she entreated. It distresses me, rather. Forgive my saying it. Where did you stay last night? So he sort of is evasive about the whole incident the night before. And he wants to get more on the subject of, how's married life? How are you doing? And, she talks about getting the note about the aunt, and that, Phillotson would have joined her, but you know how he is about taking a holiday. He doesn't really believe in them. So, he's so good to me, he didn't mind my coming. And Jude says, Mr. Phillotson obliges you in everything. As he ought, he said. Of course. It ought to be a happy wife. And of course I am. Bride, I might almost have said, as yet. It is not so many weeks since I gave you to him. And yes, I know. And so the conversation, you see he's a little bit sinister here. Well, you have my good wishes now, as always, Mrs. Phillotson. She reproached him by a glance. No, you are not, Mrs. Phillotson, murmured Jude. You are dear, free Sue Bridehead, only you don't know it. Wifedom has not yet squashed up and digested you in that vast maw as an atom which has no further individuality. Sue put on a look of being offended till she answered, nor husbandin' you, so as far as I can see. But it has, he said, shaking his head sadly. So this is a description of what it means to be married. That you're going to be squashed, eaten, spit out, and left without yourself anymore. And, even in the ancient tradition, in the marriage ceremony, you're wearing like crowns of martyrdom. It is sort of expected that you die to oneself, and this is something he knows he's pushing Sue's buttons here. And if that's not enough, you can just depend on the crusty aunt to say how it is. And so they get back, they see the aunt, who is at the moment very lively and is very much a fighter. And I read something like this and you think, we don't really have that much in common with people of Victorian times. But almost everybody has an aunt like this, or like a grandmother or somebody who just says it like it is and doesn't care if it's rude and hurts your feelings or anything like that. So she's asking Sue, and then she's also warned them about getting married in the first place. And she tells Sue, you should have done as I did, you simpleton. And Phillotson, the schoolmaster, of all men, what made you marry him? What makes most women marry, Aunt? Ah, you mean to say that you love the man. I don't mean to say anything definite. Do you love him? Don't ask me, Aunt. And she goes on and says, I can mind a man very well, a very civil, honorable liver. But Lord, I don't want to wound your feelings, but there be certain men here and there that no woman of any niceness can stomach. I should say he is one. I don't say it now, since you must know better than I, but that's what I should have said. And so she just points out to her, as Sue already kind of knows that she probably is not at all attracted to Phillotson. And so after she says it, she starts crying, and Jude says, don't cry, dear. She means well, but very crusty and queer now, Oh, no, it isn't that, said Sue, trying to dry her eyes. I don't mind her roughness one bit. What is it, then? It's what she says is true. God, what, you don't like him? I don't mean that, she said hastily. Perhaps I ought not to have married. Now, they've only been together a month. And so Sue has already realized her mistake. And now she's in that stuck place, which is a very horrible place to be. But at any rate, so when she leaves, Jude is trying to figure out, what do I do with myself now? And so he goes right back into his religious studies. It says he passed the evening and following days in mortifying by every possible means his wish to see her, nearly starving himself to extinguish by fasting his passionate tendency to love her. He read sermons on discipline and hunted up passages in church history that treated of the ascetics of the 2nd century. And the ascetics were like the very strict monks, Before he returned to Mary Green to Melchester, there arrived a letter from Arabella. The sight of it revived a stronger feeling of self-condemnation for a brief return to her society than for an attachment to Sue. And so, but fortunately, Arabella basically writes to say that her husband has taken her back, and it seems like that's going to be fine. But it's not going to be fine. Anyways. Okay, so the next chapter, he's decided he doesn't really want to be in Christminster because it's just too depressing with those shattered dreams. But he also makes this kind of as a justification for staying near Sue. He's only going to be about 12 miles from her. He's going to stay at Melchester for a while. He joins a choir in church. He's reading, the Gospels again and reading up on divinity. And this little comparison of being closer to Sue, he compares it to the saints. Sometimes they would go out to the desert, almost like they were purposely trying to be tempted by the devil to break down and to build their will. But that's kind of how he's thinking at this point. I'll just put myself in the arena and see what I'm made of. But he does, it does say here that he perceived with despondency that, taken all round, he was a man of too many passions to make a good clergyman. The utmost he could hope for was that a life of constant internal warfare between flesh and spirit of the former might not always have victorious. I probably have a typo in there somewhere. I type these up kind of fast, so sometimes they're wrong a little bit, but then I don't know that when I'm reading it until I see it. But at any rate, so there it is, also the flesh and the spirit. Sounds like a great essay to me, but it depends on what question you get, I guess. What's interesting about this little episode is that while he's in this choir, he learns a new hymn called "The Foot of the Cross," and he thinks this song is so beautiful and speaks to exactly what I'm feeling. Maybe if I just talk to this guy, I could get something out of this. Maybe he would mentor me. Maybe he's always looking for somebody, I think Hardy probably had somebody in mind, and as somebody who could write something this beautiful. And then he goes out of his way to find the guy, and all the guy can talk about is that, I've written many hymns. They're not, there's not much money in music. My real trade now is selling wine, so let me give you this advertisement. And Jude is just sort of like, it always seems like a disappointment for him every time he tries. There's always an obstacle in the way, or people just aren't what he, in his imagination, thinks they ought to be. And you would think somebody who wrote a song like that would be happy to talk about it and be encouraging and so forth. But, the economic reasons are always, stronger as well, because one does have to, eat. So the problem with this, of course, it's an unlucky thing for Jude, because he's been just dying to get, an invitation to go to Sue's house, and he misses it because he was off on this other wasteful adventure. And so it says, Jude almost tore his head out, having missed this letter till it was too late to act upon its contents. but he had chastened himself considerably of late, and at last his chimerical expedition to Kittenbridge really did seem to have been another special intervention of Providence, there's the word again, to keep him away from temptation. God was making sure he didn't get that letter. But a growing impatience of faith, which he had noticed in himself more than once of late, made him pass over in ridicule of the idea that God sent people on a fool's errand. That's something that Shakespeare refers to as well, a fool's errand. He longed to see her, telling her what had happened, and saying he had not enough patience for the following Sunday, but would come any day of the week as she likes. And so as Sue receives this letter, she immediately notices that Jude is a little overly anxious to see her, which makes her put off her response to him. And so this is kind of where it ends. So we don't really know, it doesn't go further into, what happens, except that she just held off the response for a few days. And that's all you have to the end. And so next time we'll start at Shaston, part the 4th. All right, thanks for listening.